This story is titled, My Sister Refused to Help Me When I Desperately Needed Help. Now she's demanding I pay for her kids' medical bills. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hi everyone, throwaway because my sister and family are the kind of people who'd 100% stalk my posts to prove a point. So, here's the deal. My sister, 28 married female, and I, 26 single female, aren't close, and we've never really been. Growing up, we were total opposites. She was the overachiever, super active, sports captain, every teacher's favorite. Me? Let's just say I was the one getting talks from our parents about applying myself. Even as adults, we just don't vibe. She's all about order and discipline, while I've been stumbling through life, figuring things out as I go. Anyway, rewind to 1 year ago, and my life was a complete mess. I had just lost my job. It wasn't even like I was slacking off or anything. The company just shut down out of nowhere. No warning, no severance, nothing. One day I'm sitting at my desk, planning next month's rent, and the next my manager's like, hey, sorry to do this, but we're closing. You'll get your final check in 2 weeks. I couldn't believe it. I had no backup plan, no savings, just bills piling up and rent staring me in the face. It felt like the walls were closing in. For days, I barely slept. My brain was running a marathon of panic. I tried looking for temp jobs, called up old coworkers, and even considered selling my laptop, which was basically my lifeline to finding work. But nothing was coming together. And with rent due in less than 2 weeks, I was running out of options fast. That's when I realized I'd have to do the one thing I really didn't want to do, ask my sister for help. Now, let me explain something about my sister. She's not mean exactly, but she's rigid. Everything in her life is black and white, right and wrong, her way or no way. And she's always been like that. Growing up, if I didn't do things her way, whether it was cleaning our shared room or choosing classes in high school, she'd flip out. So asking her for help wasn't just hard for me, it felt humiliating. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't turn to my parents for help either. My dad's on disability, and my mom's still struggling to pay off their mortgage. If I asked them, they'd probably dip into their retirement savings to help me, and that's the last thing I wanted. It's also probably why they've been putting pressure on me to figure things out on my own, instead of stepping in directly. So here I am with only one solution left. Begging my sister, I wish I didn't. I remember sitting on my couch, staring at my phone for what felt like hours. My pride was screaming at me not to call her. But my fear of losing my apartment won out. So I called. When she answered, she sounded annoyed, like I was interrupting her day. I tried to keep it together, but as soon as I started explaining my situation, I broke down, full-on ugly crying. I told her everything, that I'd lost my job, that I was scared, and that I just needed $1,000 to cover rent until I could figure things out. Her response? No. Just like that. Flat. Cold. No hesitation. Then she launched into this lecture about how she doesn't believe in lending money to family because it always goes wrong and ruins relationships. She said it wasn't personal, just her policy, like she was some kind of bank manager turning down a loan application. I couldn't believe it. I tried to reason with her, to explain that I wasn't asking for a handout, just a loan. But she cut me off with, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. And then she hung up. I sat there in shock, the phone still in my hand. I mean, I knew we weren't close, but this was a whole new level of cold. She didn't even offer to help in another way. No, let me talk to my husband. No, maybe I can buy you groceries or help you job hunt. Just nothing. It felt like she was slamming the door in my face, and I was left standing out in the rain. That night, I couldn't stop crying. The issue for me wasn't money anymore. Not that she didn't lend the money. It's that she didn't give a single fuck. She, Hungarian upper, on, her, sobbing, sister. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if I'd somehow offended her. But the truth was, she just didn't care. And that realization hit me harder than losing my job. She was my sister, my blood, and in my moment of need, she turned her back on me, and I didn't expect she would be that cold. I was a complete mess after that. The weight of her no wasn't just about the money. It was like being smacked in the face with the reality of our relationship, or lack of one. I mean, who does that? I wasn't some distant cousin she barely knew. I was her sister, and I wasn't asking for a shopping spree. I was asking for a lifeline. But there was no time to sit around feeling sorry for myself. Rent wasn't going to pay itself, and I couldn't afford to lose my apartment. The next morning, I woke up with puffy eyes from crying and a pounding headache, but I told myself, if she's not going to help, then screw it. I'll figure this out on my own. The first thing I did was make a list of everything I could sell. It was pathetic how little I had that was worth anything. I sold my old gaming console, the decent pair of headphones, and anything extra I sold online within a day. I even thought about pawning my laptop, but it was my only tool to search for jobs. Every sale felt like giving up a little piece of my dignity, but what choice did I have? It wasn't just the selling part that stung, it was the reminder of how precarious my situation was. While I was packing up my old console to ship it off, I kept thinking about all the little luxuries my sister took for granted. Her perfectly decorated house, her weekly Pilates classes, her husband's brand new car. She had everything, and I was over here counting pennies just to keep a roof over my head. It wasn't fair, but life isn't fair. That was a lesson I'd learned the hard way. I also decided to swallow my pride, again, and reached out to a couple of friends. That was even harder than calling my sister because, let's be real, borrowing money from friends is its own kind of awkward. But you know what? They came through. Not with big amounts, but enough to keep the landlord off my back for another couple of weeks. One friend even offered to let me crash on their couch if it came to that. That gesture alone brought me to tears. Still, I didn't want to be a burden to anyone, so I started applying for every job I could find. Temp work, retail, even stuff way out of my field. I didn't care about titles or salaries anymore. I just needed something to keep me afloat. For weeks, my days were a cycle of sending out resumes, checking job boards, and attending interviews where I'd get the same canned rejection. It was soul-crushing, but I kept going. Meanwhile, my sister didn't check in. Not once. No, how are you holding up? Or, did you figure something out? It was radio silence. And honestly, that hurt even more. It's not like I expected her to change her mind, but a text to see if I was okay wouldn't have killed her. One moment that really sticks out from that time was when I bumped into a neighbor while taking out the trash. She was this sweet older lady who lived 2 doors down, and she could tell something was off. I guess I must have looked as stressed as I felt, because she stopped me and said, "You've got a lot on your shoulders, don't you?" Before I knew it, I was spilling my guts to her, tears and all. She didn't offer me money or anything like that, but she listened. For the first time, I felt like someone actually cared. I managed to scrape by that month, but barely. I kept selling stuff and picking up odd gigs, walking dogs, assembling furniture, anything I could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me in my apartment, and that was all that mattered. Looking back, those weeks were some of the hardest of my life, but they also taught me something important. When push comes to shove, I can survive on my own. The thing is, though, that survival came at a cost. My trust in my sister has gone. Completely gone. Before this, I'd always held on to this naive hope that, despite our differences, we'd always be there for each other in the big moments. But that phone call shattered that illusion. It wasn't just about money. It was about what it represented. Her refusal wasn't just a no to helping me pay rent. It was a no to standing by me when I needed her most. For weeks, I kept replaying that conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. I wondered if maybe I'd caught her on a bad day, or if she had her own struggles I didn't know about. But then I'd remember how cold she sounded, how quick she was to shut me down, and I'd get angry all over again. It was like a cycle of hurt and frustration that I couldn't escape. The silence from her side didn't help either. I mean, even if she wasn't going to lend me the money, she could have at least checked in. A simple, "Hey, how's everything going?" would have meant the world to me. But no, she was too busy with her perfect little life to spare a thought for her struggling sister. And the more I thought about it, the more resentful I became. I didn't tell anyone else in the family about what happened. Part of me didn't want to deal with the drama, but another part of me felt embarrassed. Like, what would they even say? That I should have planned better? That I should have expected this from her? It felt easier to keep it to myself and focus on moving forward. And I did move forward, eventually. 2 years later, life looked a lot different for me. After months of grinding at that temp job, I finally landed a stable position with a decent salary. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, gave me room to breathe, and most importantly, helped me rebuild my life. I didn't hear much from my sister during that time, and honestly, I preferred it that way. It wasn't like we ever had weekly catch-ups before, and after what happened, the idea of talking to her felt like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. I knew I should have been over it by then, but the resentment lingered. I mean, how do you forget something like that? Sure, I was doing better now, but that didn't erase the fact that when I'd needed her the most, she'd slammed the door in my face. So imagine my surprise when my phone buzzed one evening, and there it was, her name lighting up my screen. For a second, I thought it must have been a mistake. She never called me. Ever. My first instinct was to ignore it, but I wanted to know why she's calling. And the moment I said hello, I knew something was wrong. She was crying. Not the delicate, sniffly kind of crying you hear in movies. This was full-on sobbing. It took her a minute to calm down enough to even get the words out. And when she did, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her husband had been laid off a few months ago, and they were struggling. On top of that, her 3-year-old daughter, my niece, needed a medical treatment that insurance wouldn't cover up front. They needed $1,500, and she was asking me for help. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what she'd just said. This was the same sister who had turned me away when I needed $1,000 to avoid losing my apartment. The same sister who had lectured me about not lending money to family, and now she was asking me to bail her out? She must have sensed my hesitation, because she quickly launched into a speech about how dire the situation was. "It's for my daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "She's just a baby, and we don't have anyone else to turn to." She begged me, practically pleading through the phone. "Please, I'll pay you back as soon as we get reimbursed. I swear." And here's the thing. I love my niece. She's adorable, sweet, and completely innocent in all of this. But as much as I cared about her, I couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. 2 years ago, I'd been the one on the other end of that call, desperate and scared, and my sister had shut me down without a second thought. Now, here she was, expecting me to swoop in and save the day. I took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Only silence on the other end. I could almost hear her taking a deep breath, gearing up for what I knew was coming. And then, like a switch had been flipped, she exploded. "How could you do this?" she screamed. "This isn't about me. This is about my daughter, your niece. How can you punish an innocent child just to get back at me? What kind of person does that?" I held the phone away for a second, stunned. "You're petty, vindictive, selfish. That's what you are. Selfish." "Calm down," I said. "You're not being fair right now. I'm not punishing anyone, least of all my niece. But I'm not going to hand over money when you haven't even been honest with me." "Honest with you?" she snapped. "What the hell does that even mean? You think I'm lying about my daughter's health now? God, you've really sunk low, haven't you?" "I didn't say that," I replied. "But you weren't upfront about where the money would actually go. You told me it was all for medical bills, but I found out a big chunk of it is for other expenses. That's not okay, and you know it." She didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. Instead, she doubled down. "You have no idea what it's like to be in my position. My husband's out of work, we're drowning in bills, and I'm doing everything I can to keep this family afloat. But you're just sitting there on your high horse, judging me like you're so much better." I told her, "This isn't about me being better or worse. This is about boundaries. 2 years ago, I was in a terrible spot. I came to you for help, and you said no. Fine, that was your choice. But now, you're in a similar situation, and you expect me to just forget all of that and bail you out? Do you see how unfair that is? Don't you dare compare this to what happened 2 years ago," she shouted. "You needed money for rent. That's not the same as needing money for my child's health. You're a grown adult. You could have figured it out on your own." "And I did," I shot back. "I figured it out on my own because I had no other choice. And guess what? You do have other choices. Sell some stuff, borrow smaller amounts from other people, figure out a payment plan. But don't stand here and act like I'm the bad guy for not swooping in to fix everything." "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me?" she said. "That's rich coming from someone who's always been a screw-up. You're just jealous that I've done better for myself, and now you're using this as some sick way to get back at me." "Jealous of you?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You think this is about jealousy? No, babe. This is about you showing your true colors. You set the rules for our relationship when you refused to help me. I'm just playing by those same rules now. If you don't like it, maybe you should have thought about that before." She came back with one last jab. "You're heartless. Completely heartless. I hope you can live with yourself knowing you're letting your niece suffer because of your stupid grudge." She scoffed loudly, and then there was a loud click as she hung up. I sat there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me wanted to cry, but another part of me felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time, I'd stood my ground against her, and even though it was messy and painful, I knew it was the right thing to do. But here's the thing. I wasn't being petty. I wasn't even trying to get revenge. I was just holding her to the same standard she'd set for our relationship. She was the one who'd made it clear that we weren't the kind of family that helped each other out. She'd set the rules, and now she was mad that I was following them. That conversation blew up everything. Within hours, my mom was calling me, demanding to know what had happened. Apparently, my sister had gone straight to our parents, painting me as some heartless monster who was letting my niece suffer out of spite. My mom begged me to reconsider, saying, "It's not about your sister. It's about your niece." Even my dad, who usually stayed out of our drama, called me to say he was disappointed in me. It was overwhelming, to say the least. I felt like I was being ganged up on, like no one even cared to hear my side of the story. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that standing my ground was the right thing to do. If I gave in now, what kind of message would that send? That she could treat me however she wanted, and I'd still come running whenever she needed me? No, thank you. Still, it wasn't an easy decision. I kept thinking about my niece and how none of this was her fault. Part of me wanted to help, but every time I considered it, I'd hear my sister's words from 2 years ago echoing in my head. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Over the next few days, the tension in the family only got worse. My parents kept calling, trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. My sister sent me a flurry of angry texts, accusing me of being cruel and ungrateful. At one point, she even tried to loop in some extended family members to gang up on me, but thankfully, they stayed out of it. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she was letting on. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me, so I decided to do a little digging. I reached out to a mutual friend who was closer to my sister, just to ask if they knew what was going on. And that's when I found out the truth. Turns out, my niece's medical situation wasn't as dire as my sister had made it seem. The treatment was more nice to have than life or death. And the $1,500? It wasn't just for the medical bill. She was planning to use some of it to catch up on overdue bills and other expenses. When I asked if my sister had mentioned anything serious, like medical issues or something urgent involving my niece, the friend seemed genuinely confused. They said my sister hadn't mentioned anything about a medical problem. Instead, the last they'd heard from her was her usual complaints about money being tight and the stress of her husband's unemployment. There was no indication of anything urgent or life-threatening, which only confirmed my suspicions that the story wasn't adding up. When I heard that, any lingering guilt I felt disappeared. It wasn't just that she'd asked me for help. It was that she'd lied to manipulate me into saying yes. She'd used her own child as a pawn to tug at my heartstrings, and that was something I couldn't forgive. So yeah, the tables had turned. But I wasn't about to play the game by her rule. If she wanted to fix her problems, she'd have to do it without me. But the family wasn't letting this go. Of course there were my parents. My mom called me at least 3 times a day, each time with a slightly different angle to try to guilt-trip me. She ranted about how turning my back on family. Another was focused entirely on my niece. "You might not care about your sister," she said, "but what about that sweet little girl? What has she ever done to you?" My dad, who normally avoided these situations, called once to tell me that I was being cold and selfish. It was hard to hear, even though I knew they didn't have the full story. I tried explaining my side. I told my mom exactly what my sister had said to me 2 years ago, when I'd needed her help. I reminded her how I'd scraped by on my own, without turning to the family for more than emotional support. But my mom wasn't having it. "That was different," she said. "You didn't have a child to think about." It didn't seem to matter to her that I'd been just as desperate, just as scared. To her, the only thing that mattered now was that my niece needed help, and I wasn't giving it. Then, of course, there were the texts from my sister. She was blowing up my phone with paragraph after paragraph of accusations and insults. One message would be her begging me to reconsider. The next would be her calling me names. The whiplash was real. My favorite text, if you can even call it that, was a 6-part rant about how I was lucky to be in a position to help and how I didn't understand what it was like to struggle. That one nearly made me throw my phone across the room. I really wanted to reply, "Oh, I don't know what it's like to struggle? Did you forget about 2 years ago when I was crying to you about losing my apartment?" But I didn't. I knew it wouldn't get through to her. And honestly, I didn't want to waste the energy. At one point, she tried to drag some of our extended family into the mess. I woke up one morning to find a flurry of texts from cousins, aunts, and even a couple of family friends, all saying some variation of, "How could you let your niece suffer?" Most of them didn't even know the full story. They just heard her version, which I'm sure made me sound like the villain of the century. I ended up putting half of them on mute, just to get a break from the constant notifications. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when my sister decided to involve our parents even more directly. She showed up at their house one afternoon with my niece in tow, using her as some kind of prop in this twisted guilt campaign. My mom called me later that day. "Your niece was here today," she said, as if I didn't already know where this conversation was going. "She doesn't understand why her auntie won't help her mommy." I wanted to scream. It wasn't my niece's fault. I knew that. But the fact that my sister was willing to use her own child as a weapon in this fight made my blood boil. It was manipulative, plain and simple, and it only made me more determined to stand my ground. Still, the guilt wasn't easy to shake. Every time I thought about my niece, I felt this ache in my chest. She was just a kid, completely innocent in all of this. She didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of our family drama. Eventually, I decided I needed to take control of the narrative. I couldn't keep letting my sister twist the story to make me look like the bad guy. So I decided to throw some facts on the family group chat. We have this big family group chat, where we act nice and throw fake compliments on each other. You know the type. Here's what I wrote. Hi everyone. I want to clear the air about what's been going on because I think there's been some misunderstanding. 2 years ago, I was in a tough spot and reached out to my sister for help. I was on the verge of losing my apartment and asked to borrow $1,000. She said no, which was her choice, and I respected that, even though it hurt. Well now, and my sister asked me for $1,500. At first, I thought it was for my niece's medical bills, but I found out later that wasn't the whole truth. A large portion of the money was for other expenses. I'm not sharing this to shame anyone. I just want to explain why I made the decision I did. I don't believe in being manipulated, and I don't think it's fair to twist the story to make me look like the villain. I love my niece and would never want her to suffer. But this situation isn't as black and white as it's been made out to be. I'm happy to help directly with my niece's medical bills if that's truly needed, but I won't hand over cash without transparency. I hope you can all understand where I'm coming from. I sent it and immediately muted the chat. I couldn't handle the anxiety of waiting for replies, so I went for a walk to clear my head. By the time I got back, there were over 50 messages. Most were from my sister, who had clearly lost it. I didn't want to address her lying to everyone outright, but I needed to show my parents the truth. I knew they wouldn't believe me if I just accused her of lying. They'd need proof. So, the next day, I decided to call the hospital to ask about the payment options for the treatment my sister claimed was urgent. They were polite but firm, explaining that there was no record of any patient with my niece's name registered for treatment. So I gathered everything to forward to my parents. It was the only way to make them see that my sister had fabricated the entire situation. My mom sounded relieved, but my dad was livid. Why didn't she tell us any of this? He asked. I didn't have an answer. My sister's actions didn't make sense to me either. Was it pride? Desperation? Or was she just so used to manipulating people that she didn't know how to be honest anymore? After weeks of drama, lies, and family turmoil, I was done. Done with the constant back and forth, done with being guilt-tripped, and done with letting my sister's manipulations control my life. It was time to take charge and set boundaries. Not just with her, but with my entire family. So I reached out to my parents again. I knew they were stuck in the middle, trying to mediate and keep the peace, but their constant pressure to fix things was draining me. I called them separately to make my stance clear. When I spoke to my mom, I told her, I love you, but this situation with my sister is toxic. I've explained my side and I've done more than enough to offer help directly for my niece. But now that we know she lied about the medical bills, I can't get involved anymore. I need you to respect my decision and stop pushing me to change my mind. She sighed heavily, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, but she surprised me. I understand, honey, she said quietly. I just hate seeing the family like this. I do too, I admitted. But this isn't on me. My sister created this situation when she lied to everyone. She needs to own up to her actions. I can't fix this for her, and I won't be dragged into it anymore. My dad was a little harder to convince. Family is family, he said. You don't turn your back on them no matter what. Dad, I didn't turn my back on her, I replied. She turned her back on all of us when she lied and manipulated the situation to make herself look like a victim. You saw the proof from the hospital. There was no treatment scheduled for my niece. She made it all up, and now she's trying to guilt me into cleaning up her mess. That's not what family is supposed to do. He didn't say much after that, but I could tell he was mulling it over. I knew he wouldn't fully agree with me, but at least I'd said my piece. I also made the decision to block my sister's number. It felt extreme, but every interaction with her had been toxic, and I needed space to heal. Before blocking her, I sent her one last message. I love my niece, and I'll always be here for her if she truly needs me. But I can't continue this back and forth with you. It's unhealthy for both of us. I hope one day we can rebuild our relationship, but for now, I need space. Please respect that. She didn't reply before I blocked her, and honestly, I didn't expect her to. I knew this wouldn't be the end of her attempts to stir up drama, but at least I'd taken a step toward protecting my peace. With those boundaries in place, I finally felt like I could breathe again. For the first time in weeks, I had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The anger, the hurt, the constant questioning of whether I'd done the right thing. It had all taken a toll on me. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt about my niece. She was the one person in this whole mess who truly didn't deserve any of it. I decided to send her a small care package. Nothing too extravagant, just a few toys and books I knew she'd love. I included a handwritten note that said, "I love you so much, and I'm always here for you. I hope you enjoy these gifts. Love, Auntie." I sent it through my parents to avoid any direct contact with my sister, and they promised to pass it along. As the weeks turned into months, I heard less and less about my sister. My parents stopped bringing her up as much, and the group chat quieted down. I didn't know if she'd moved on or was just plotting her next move, but either way, I didn't care. I was done letting her take up space in my head. One unexpected silver lining was the support I got from some of my cousins. After my message in the group chat, a few of them reached out privately to say they admired how I'd handled everything. One cousin even said, "I've always felt like you're acted entitled, but no one ever called her out. Good for you for standing your ground." Hearing that meant more than I can say. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, even if it sometimes felt that way. Eventually, I reached a point where I could think about my sister without feeling a knot of anger in my stomach. I still didn't trust her, and I doubted I ever would, but I didn't feel consumed by the situation anymore. I'd found peace, not because the situation was resolved, but because I'd made the choice to prioritize my own well-being. As for my sister, who knows what the future holds? Maybe one day we'll find a way to rebuild our relationship, but for now, I'm okay with keeping my distance. Life is too short to spend it tangled up in someone else's toxicity. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that peace is priceless. And I'm not willing to sacrifice it for anyone, not even family. Thanks for reading, you guys. I'm excited to hear your opinions on this in the comments.